Hey everybody, it's Nate and Steph from Adventure to Backpack. It's time for another solar install.
If this is your first time to our channel, we travel around in our custom DIY sprinter and have as many adventures as possible. If this sounds like your kind of adventure, be sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell.
Let's get to work.
About a year ago, we made a tutorial covering how we installed solar on our camper van. We installed 825 watts of solar with 700 amp hours of batteries. But we were met with one big problem. This system was way too big for most people. We heard you.
But this install doesn't have anything to do with our camper van. My mom just bought a truck camper, and we're going to teach you step by step how to make the exact same solar setup that we're going to install in this one.
Which includes 400 watts of solar and 200 amp hours of Battle-Born lithium batteries.
Now before we get started, let me tell you where you can find the wiring diagram and the parts list for this particular project. Are you listening? Because this is very, very important.
Yes, Nate, we're listening.
Go ahead and scroll down to the link in the description below. It'll only take 30 seconds, and we'll wait for you. This link will send you to our website where you can put in your email address and we can send you the wiring diagrams and parts list for this build. Be sure to check your spam folder because sometimes the stuff does end up there.
Okay, perfect, done.
Hey Steph, before we put hands on tools, you got about 45 seconds to explain how solar works. Ready, set, go.
Sure, I can do that. Check this out. Solar energy comes down from the sun and is collected by the solar panels. That energy comes through these wires down to the solar controller. The solar panels make variable voltages, anywhere from the teens to hundreds of volts, depending on how they're wired, but that's really not important right now. What is important is the solar controller takes that variable voltage and converts it into a voltage that is usable by the batteries, somewhere in the 13 to 15 volt range in our case. That energy then goes from the charge controller down to the batteries where the energy is stored for use. Now, how do we use that power? Well, there's really two ways: 12 volt power and 110 volt power. So a few examples of 12 volt powered items are things like 12 volt lights, roof fans, 12 volt, also known as cigarette lighter sockets, and USB outlets. The other way is 110 volt power, which is essentially just your common household plug. Things like coffee pots, TVs, and blenders are a few examples of those, just your normal household plug. Now, 12 volt powered appliances can be wired right to the battery, but for 110, the power from the battery needs to go through an inverter to change to your normal household plug. This install is for a truck camper, but it would be the same idea for a camper van as well. All of that information can be found in the download in the description below. Now, let's get to work.
Let's start with the solar panels up top. They're going to be laid out like this. This is a 400 watt system we're going to be installing. We're going to be using both the pre-installed factory roof rails as well as the solar panel mounting brackets to mount these panels. And with a few changes to components, we could have actually fit 600 watts of solar up here. But we're not going to talk about that in this video, but that information can be found in your email download. Let's start with installing the wire entry gland. The parts you'll need are the entry gland, positive and negative wires, butyl tape, a screw gun, screws, 1-inch hole saw, roof sealant, and painter's tape. We've already determined the location we're going to bring the wires into the camper, so now we need to drill the hole. Assemble the entry gland and secure it to the roof with butyl tape, screws, and sealant. For this 400 watt setup, the parts we're going to be using on the roof are going to be 4 100 watt solar panels, MC4 connectors, MC4 wire crimper, 30 amp MC4 fuse, and all the mounting hardware that you can find in the list in the solar ebook. Now let's start with the solar panel mounted on the front of the camper.
We've heard rumors of the factory installed solar panels of this particular brand of truck camper breaking away from the roof while driving down the road. We're gonna make sure that doesn't happen. Attach the mounting feet to the solar panel. Mark the location of the mounting feet on the roof. Drill the holes using the mounting feet as templates. So clean the area where the feet will sit with alcohol. Fill the screw holes with epoxy and insert the anchors. Clean the mounting feet with alcohol. Apply 3M foam tape to the mounting feet. Place butyl tape around the perimeter of the mounting feet. Place the solar panel back into place. Screw the panel to the anchors. Finally, liberally coat the edges of the mounting feet and screw heads with roof sealant.
The next 3 solar panels that we're going to be mounting, we're actually going to be mounting them on the factory roof rails of that truck camper. These are just going to be mounted with nuts and bolts directly to the roof rails. All of this really just depends on what you have on your own setup. So if you have roof rails, use them. If you don't, kind of have to find out your own way. But if you have any questions about any of that kind of stuff and want suggestions, please leave it in the comments below.
We got all of the panels mounted to the roof racks, and so now we're going to put the panels up on the roof. Let's move to the inside of the camper. So the bulk of the equipment is actually going to be installed right down here. This is the perfect space for both batteries, the inverter, and the charge controller. Both of the Battle-Born lithium batteries will be surrounded by a DIY aluminum cage. The inverter will sit on top of that. Let's start building the cage.
Here's the parts you're going to need for the next step. You're going to need both of your Battle-Born lithium batteries, your inverter, your 80/20 aluminum extrusion, your 80/20 corner brackets, and a 2.5mm hex key, and a saw to cut the aluminum. A chop saw would be best, but I'll leave the saw choice up to you. We're going to be building the cage out of this 80/20 aluminum extrusion and these 80/20 corner brackets. It's all a bolt together unit, so there's no welding necessary. It's very beginner DIY friendly.
Now that the cage is built, let's go install it in the camper.
We got the battery cage mounted to the floor. We got the batteries setting inside of the cage. Now it's time to take some measurements for the wires that are going to go to the bus bars and the shunt and all the other components that you can find in your free email download. So we're going to take the measurements and then go inside and start making wires. And for us to get accurate measurements for our battery cables, we're going to go ahead and install the bus bars as well as the shunt so we can see where the end goal is going to be. We're going to mount the shunt right here, and the negative bus bar and the positive bus bar right there.
We took some measurements and now we've come into the garage to make the wires. So now we're going to attach the lugs to the end of the wires. This is the finished product. We've got a few more wires to do, but the principle is the same across all of them.
Now it's time to install the MC4 connectors on all of the wires up on top of the roof for the solar panels. These are the 2 wires that come down from the entry gland. Unscrew the MC4 connector and disassemble it. Strip off a 1/2 inch of the sheathing on the wire. Position the crimp pin, big pin for male, little pin for female. Insert the wire through the cap as well as the waterproof gasket. And then push the pin into the MC4 connector until you hear a click. Tighten the cap and gasket down onto the MC4 connector. We've got quite a few more connections to make, but the process is essentially the same on the male and the female ends. So that's the finished product of these two connections. We have a few more of those to do up on the roof. I'll show you the final product of that as soon as I'm finished with it, but ultimately I think it's going to make way more sense if you just refer to the wiring diagram and see how we hooked it up from there. And now back inside to the electrical compartment, we are going to make the connection to our solar controller. These are the wires that are coming in from the roof. I have disconnected the power at the MC4 connectors that are up top, so there's no danger here. Connection's going to be pretty simple. The PV is your solar panels, and you've got a minus and a plus for positive and negative. I've left a little bit of slack in the wires. I'm pretty sure it's going to be mounted right here, but we have a few more components that are going to be mounted in here as well, so we're not going to mount it just yet. I want to get everything test fitted first, so we're going to be putting this right here for now. And now we're going to make the battery connection. Battery connection is pretty much the same as the solar panels. You got a positive and negative for your battery. And these are going to connect to the positive and negative bus bars. A quick note about some of the fuses you could use in the system. We're going to be holding off on some of our fuses because they have not arrived yet, but they can all be found in the solar wiring diagram in your ebook download. The solar controller is going to be mounted over here in this general area, but we have a few other components that we need to find out exactly where they're going to sit before we mount this permanently. So that's just going to stay there for now. So I know it doesn't really look like it right now, but we are actually very, very close to being done. Now there's a few things that we need to talk about before we move on. So right now we have DC power coming from the solar panels into the solar controller into the batteries. The batteries are hooked up to the inverter, so we have AC power ready to go. Now this is where it starts to get a little bit tricky because everybody's setup from here on out is going to be different. From this point back, everything is pretty much the same. Everybody's going to have solar panels, everybody's going to have an inverter, the batteries, all that kind of stuff. Now where it gets tricky is if you're doing this from scratch in a camper van or something like that, where you're building the entire electrical system, this is where you're going to start going from inverter to all of your plugs, as well as your bus bar to your fuse block and stuff like that. All of that information can be found again in the email download, but what we're going to have to do now is, since this is in a camper that has a already established wiring system installed, we're going to have to start making very specialized connections that have to do exactly with this truck camper. Now this truck camper is set up like most RVs, and so if you have an RV and you're wanting to set up this particular setup, definitely hang around because it's going to be very, very similar. If you're building a camper van from scratch, this is also going to be helpful, but what's going to be even more helpful is some of those wiring diagrams in that ebook. So the only other connections that we need to make right now for the AC power, we have the AC out and the AC in. AC in is going to be your shore power. AC out is going to be to your plugs, your AC breaker box, whatever the case is in your particular setup. Up there, positive bus bar, negative bus bar, that's what's going to run to all of your accessories. So that's going to likely run to a fuse block. And then from that fuse block, that's going to go off to all of your branch circuits like your lights, your fans, all that kind of stuff. So we are going to run all of this stuff to the AC in, the AC out, and going to set all this up to the pre-existing setup that is over here. Everything over in this particular RV is set up over here. It looks like a mess right now. I've already gotten into it a little bit to find out exactly what I'm dealing with, but the way I think it's going to be less confusing is if I actually just go through and do it and then show you what I did and try to relate it back to some of those wiring diagrams. So I'm going to get to work.
We just finished up a bunch of wiring, so let's talk through it. This solar panel and that solar panel are wired in series, and then that solar panel and that solar panel are wired in series. Both of those series are then wired in parallel, and that wire runs down through the entry gland, through the roof, down into the camper.
The wires come through the roof, down through this wire loom, through the kitchen console, through this bunch of wires, this bunch of wires, this bunch of wires, all the way over to the charge controller. Charge controller then takes that energy from the solar panels and converts it into a form of energy usable by the batteries. From the charge controller, the wires go through this wire and this wire to the positive and negative bus bars, and then from the positive and negative bus bars, it loops around and goes to the batteries where that energy is then stored for use. So that's one way we charge the batteries. Let's talk about shore power.
Shore power is when we're plugged into a wall outlet like this, and then this cable goes to the shore power connection on the outside of the camper, which then connects to this wire, which runs through here, into this box, through here, all the way around here, and finally into the inverter charger right there. The inverter charger then takes that AC power that we're on shore power, the charger converts it into DC power, which then charges the batteries underneath. The third way that we can charge our batteries is through the alternator on the truck, but we're not going to talk about that in this particular video. We're going to save that for another video. Now let's talk about how we can use all of that power that we've stored up.
The power in the batteries is stored as DC power. From the batteries, that runs to the bus bars, back through these cables, over here to the distribution block, or your fuse block. All of these fuses, automotive style fuses. That's what's going to be powered directly off of the battery with nothing in between. From the DC fuse block, that's going to power things like the water pump over there, lights up here. This fridge can actually run off of DC power. The USB ports that are up front, all of that kind of stuff is powered directly off of the batteries. Now, if you're wanting to power a household plug like that one, you're going to need the inverter. Let's talk about that. The inverter simply takes the DC power stored in the batteries and converts it to AC power. So batteries to household plug, essentially. From the inverter, it goes out through this cable right here, ours is yellow in this case, to this breaker box. Now this breaker box is essentially the exact same circuit that you're going to have in your house. It is a 15 amp AC circuit. From there, it goes out to over here, where it actually ties into all of the AC plugs throughout the entire camper. Now AC power, normal household plug. That's going to be things like a blender, a coffee maker, electric hedge trimmers, anything like that.
So now let's talk about how we know how much power we have, how much power we're using, and how much power we're bringing in. This right here is the shunt. So think of this as the monitor for all of the electricity in this system. So everything, whether it's AC or DC powered, is coming through this so it can be monitored from the batteries. This wire right here is the power coming from the batteries. And then this wire right here is running up here to the display. So this display shows us the current output and the current monitoring information from that shunt. Now this is just a kind of a general overview, but to get the actual detailed information, this app that connects through Bluetooth to your phone and shows all of the vital statistics of the system.
So if you're doing like a camper van build or anything like that, this is kind of where the information starts to get a little bit irrelevant for you, but hang on, because it might still help out, because you're going to go from your positive bus bar to your fuse block. You're going to go from this breaker down here off of the AC side to all of your plugs, everything like that. Remember, all that's in the wiring diagram in the ebook download, but right now we're going to talk about some of the specific things to this particular truck camper that we had to change in order for this system to work. So let's take a look at the power distribution panel of this particular truck camper. So for this particular truck camper, you're able to run things off of AC that are the outlets, the refrigerator, the air conditioner, the microwave, and the Aldi system, which is, let's just call that the furnace, because that's kind of sort of what it is. So all of these are the AC breakers, and this one up here was the one for the normal household plug circuits, and that's all we wanted to run off of our solar panel array. Things like the refrigerator, the refrigerator actually runs off of AC power, DC power, or propane. We never want to run it off of our batteries because that's a waste of energy running it through the inverter to power it. So we never wanted to use that. We cannot run the air conditioner off of this particular setup. This solar panel array is too small to power a super power hungry air conditioner, and it just would not work. So we wanted to make sure we never accidentally used these two circuits on our solar panel array. And so what we did is we basically isolated this breaker. Let's talk about how we did that. If you'll remember from just a few minutes ago, this is where I said the AC came out through this breaker back over this direction. This is that same wire over here. Now this white wire coming out was the same wire that was right back here. That was connected to this breaker right here, which was all of the outlets. It is totally removed from here. So this one is actually doing nothing. There's nothing hooked up to this one at all. But we wanted to be able to run all of this other stuff like the furnace, the microwave, the air conditioner, and the fridge whenever we're plugged into shore power. So this one, this 30 amp main, is the shore power. So shore power is still powering all of this by totally bypassing the inverter charger. So from the shore power coming in, it's going into this particular junction box. And from this junction box, it's going over to the charger, which we talked about that earlier. That's how we charge the batteries, right? And from the other side, it's coming out and it's going up this way. So we have spliced this wire. So the shore power coming from the side of the truck camper going into this junction box. One wire is going off to charge the batteries. The other wire is going into this power distribution block to power the air conditioner, the microwave, everything like that. On this truck camper and most other campers in general, there's something on them called a converter. And what a converter does is it takes AC power and powers DC power directly from the converter. AC power in to the converter, and then it powers the lights directly without the use of a battery. Since we have a inverter charger as well as the batteries, we needed to be able to get around the converter on this one. Having the converter still hooked up created an awkward loop of energy, and there was a few redundancies, and basically it just made wiring kind of messy. So that was something that needed to be undone on this particular system. So on this particular truck camper, these two screws come off and the converter is in this panel right below it. It is very, very simple to just unhook the AC power as well as the DC power from each side of it, wrap the wires back up, and put them back in there and totally disconnect that from the whole system. We just totally took it out of play because it was just a redundancy that we didn't need. It was making our wiring more messy. And that finishes up this solar build. Special shout out to Battleborn Batteries for sponsoring this build and for wanting to be a part of our journey to educate everybody on how they can build their own DIY solar setup.
We know we covered a lot of information in a very short amount of time, so if you have any questions or comments about this solar setup or your own solar setup, be sure to leave them in the comments below. Until next time, bye-bye!
See you later!